Okay, in this video we are going to look at data, and I'll just look at all the data in one video, however long it takes. Um, Before we start, I want you to reflect on your prior knowledge. So some of you probably remember your answers and the questions and answers from last week's Gapminder quiz. So if you do, you can kind of just remember what you answered then. And if you don't remember that, you can just answer this in your head now. So the question is, in the last 30 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has, and the choices you can have is increased a lot, decreased a lot, or not changed much. Okay, so if you don't remember your answer from the Gapminder quiz, take a second to think about it. And what do you think your answer is, or what was your answer before you got a chance to look at the information in the last unit? All right, so what I'm going to show you now is a chart of the responses from people who were asked this question in the UK, and you'll kind of see if where yours lines up with them. So 55% said it has increased, 33% said it's about the same, and 12% said decreased. So as you can tell by the colors, guess who was right? So actually, decreased was right. So not only decreased, as you're going to see in the data I'm going to show you, poverty decreased greatly, like crazy over this time period. And this is a story a lot of people don't know, especially a lot of people who don't live in developing countries are not aware of this. And so it's a pretty interesting story to understand. So I thought it was important to kind of, before we start looking at the data, to first think, well, how is this data maybe going to be quite different than my prior belief about this? If you were one of the people that said you were sure it's increased, it's not really your fault. There's a couple reasons for this. One is the media tends to be quite negative, and so we tend they tend to focus on the kind of worst of everything. And a lot of people kind of always tend to think everything's getting worse. In fact, a few things are getting worse. Global warming, for example, and lots of things are getting better and better and better. So, anyways, but we tend to focus on the worst things that are getting worse. The second thing is because of the financial crisis and the economic problems in the U.S. and Europe. A lot of people kind of tend to assume that the entire world has also been going through some economic crisis in recent times. And so people also were in low-income countries were also falling further and further behind. In reality, during this last, let's say, 12 years since the financial crisis, lots of developing countries have been growing quite a lot. And so if anything, they've been maybe a lot of them, especially in Asia, have been catching up to the high income countries. So anyways, just a story you might have missed. Now let's go on and look at a few different pieces of data. Okay, the first thing is, and if the font is a little bit too small, I will say verbally, and then you can also get the PPT that I upload to Canvas to take a second look at it. So this is about poverty, and it's using this $1.90 a day line, which is the old $1 line. Okay, so but by this time that they were setting this data, I think they were doing this in 2015. They were using the $1.90 line, which again the old $1 line. And so they said, well, back in 1990, how many people were below this line? And then they went to the present, which was 2015 at the time, and then they projected 15 years into the future, which is now 10 years into the future. Okay, and it is amazing what happened during this time period. Okay, so 1990. Oops, my thing is too strong. Okay, 1990 right here, 1.9 billion people were living in this extreme poverty, below this extreme cutoff. And that was over a third of the world's population. And where were they living? Well, the biggest number were living in East Asia and the Pacific, and then South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, but the biggest number was in East Asia. So at this time, China was a very poor country. In fact, I believe there was over 700 million people living in China alone who were living in extreme poverty, below this $1 a day, $1.90 line that we talked about. Okay, so then what happened? Well, what happened is from 1990 until now, there's been a tremendous fall in poverty. And where did it fall the most? It fell the most in East Asia. Again, this story is partially about China, but not only about China, because the same thing happened for almost all of the other countries in East Asia, not just China alone. And the Pacific. I believe the East Asia numbers also include what many people call Southeast Asia. Okay, I think that is included in the East Asia numbers because there's also been a tremendous fall in poverty in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Thailand, etc. So down to the current time, we also have in South Asia quite a big fall. It's not quite as big as it looks because you just have to look at the height of the South Asia portion. So it has fallen quite a lot. Okay, it has fallen quite a lot, but it's still significant. Okay, by 2015, it's still significant, right? But it's still fallen a lot. So by 2015, they estimated about 730 million people still living in poverty, in this extreme poverty. People may be low income, but not as extreme as it was before, which is about 10% of the world's population. So again, this is amazing. This is an absolutely amazing change that has taken place. Couple of more points. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only part of this story that is not the story of everything is getting better. Okay, and actually within Sub-Saharan Africa, we can find plenty of countries that have seen a large drop in poverty, but we've also find some large countries where poverty has actually increased. The other thing, the kind of the silver lining going on in Sub-Saharan Africa is the poverty rates have decreased, but the absolute numbers went up during this period, partly because this was a period of very rapid population growth. Okay, so lots of people were coming out of poverty, but because the population was growing rapidly, the proportion of people in poverty was not growing, was actually shrinking, but the number of people in poverty did grow during this time. So that is and then the final one you might be a little surprised about Latin America, is that the numbers are not bigger. Well, one of the things you might have noticed from the income chapter a couple weeks ago is almost all, well, when I say Latin America, I actually really mean North and South America, all the developing countries in North and South America. It's just kind of my lazy shorthand for that. I know a few of the countries are not considered technically part of Latin America. So anyways, if you saw from that, almost all the countries in this region are middle income. And so the countries have tremendous problems with inequality, income inequality, and also problems with unequal distribution of important resources like land. And there's also problems of indigenous minority groups not being able to access economic resources, and etc. And there's also problems of crime and insecurity. So there's lots of issues, but this type of extreme poverty, the less than what used to be the $1 a day line, is actually not very common in Latin America. So you might be a little bit surprised about that, but we'll look into that further. So because of this, we're going to spend most of our time, or most of our examples will be coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, but we'll be focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa, but we'll also be looking at the other regions as well. And you can kind of keep this picture in mind when we're looking at regions, so you can kind of remember, well, what's been going on in those regions over this time. And so they estimate that by 2030, if nothing changes, then the amount of people in poverty will be about 500 million, so 500 million. So that will be, a little more than a quarter of what it was in 1990, which is pretty amazing progress for a 40-year period. So we'll see. Okay, let's continue. Yeah, I know we're going a little slow here, but we want to get through these carefully. Okay, this number is from 2013. I didn't have a more updated visual. This is from an organization called Our World in Data that does these data visualizations. And so, as you can see, the color indicates region, and then the individual countries, it lists the number of people living in this below this extreme poverty line. And so, just looking at a couple of things, so we see, well, in Asia, India has a big number. The number is smaller now, but it had a big number. But still, relative to the population, this is less than 20%. Okay, relative to the population. China used to be, again, like I said, 700 million, 60-something% of the population was in extreme poverty back in 1990, and now it's tiny, and it's much smaller than this. So this is like amazing that this has happened, and that's what people are always referring to when they talk about the growth miracle of China. They're not just talking about wealthy people, they're also talking about people becoming much, much, much less poor. And we can see a few countries where the poverty is still concentrated in the Asia region: Indonesia, Bangladesh, Philippines, and Pakistan. But most, if not all of these, have been reducing. So we see the big number going on in Africa. Now, some countries we've seen poverty becoming worse. The DRC is one example of that. Okay, but we also have plenty of other countries on here where actually these poverty numbers have been improving over time, especially relative to the population. Okay, especially relative to the population. Finally, looking down at the bottom at Latin America, we can see that there's the numbers are way smaller than the other countries, but there still is a big number of people living in extreme poverty in these countries. And the one thing that's about this is this has been quite consistent. So it hasn't changed quite as much as, for example, the Asia numbers did. And we can see as a percentage, Haiti would be the one country that has a relatively large percentage of people living in extreme poverty. It's also the lowest income country in the Americas region. So anyways, we'll be looking a little bit at each one of these, but again, kind of keep this overview in mind. The final story. This is a really, really long story. So this story goes back to 1820. So the final story is, well, and I'll draw a line down the middle. So a couple of different researchers did research about historical poverty, and they drew a $2 line and a $1 line using that 1980s definition of 1 and 2, and they went back to 1820 using historical data, and they said, well, almost 90% of the world's population was living in poverty in historical times, and it fell slowly during this time period, and it kept falling slowly up until World War II. And then after World War II, it fell quickly. And so world poverty, this is a story that you do not hear often, at least not outside of economics courses, is basically back in the 1800s, the entire world, almost the entire world, was very poor and living at the edge of survival in terms of living standards. And now that has fallen tremendously. Okay, so it's fallen tremendously. Now, again, this does not mean that there are not still serious issues of development. It also does not mean there's not extremely serious poverty, but it's still something positive that we should recognize. And this biggest part this shows is the power of economic growth. Okay, shows the power of economic growth. It didn't happen in one specific country where there was one specific set of policies. It happened around the world in a variety of countries and a variety of situations. So we'll come back and look a little bit about this later.